find my screen share button. So many windows.
Yeah, right.
I think I'm just going to share my entire screen. That might actually be easier. Nope, it won't let me. Application window. Here. Share your screen. No? I'm actually having a problem. Do I need permission?
You need a Chrome extension if it's the first time, but
no, definitely not the first time. It's just I'm trying to share from a Keynote instead of from Chrome, and it's being. Oh, here we go. It's limited by which panel I'm on. All right, cool. So let's start. All right, so this conversation is going to be about ethics. It's going to be about ethics in the context of DAOs. We're going to touch on a couple different things. One is design ethics, one is business ethics, and then from there we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about DAOs, but I am going to motivate on DAOs first. So I'm going to talk about the idea that a DAO is essentially a community scale cyborg. This sounds kind of silly, but what we're basically doing is creating a piece of intelligence at the community scale that is representing both algorithms and human behavior, human preferences, utilities, private signals. And whenever we're dealing with a DAO, what we're actually making is not at the scale of an individual user, but the user, we can interpret it as a community. But unfortunately, that doesn't remove the need to meet the needs of the individual user. So we have this natural stress between the idea of the value to the community and the idea of the value to the individual member of the community. And when we start to deal with this, we're actually entering something that's actually much more aligned with AI and automation ethics. And I'm going to sort of jump to this quote that is from the head of the MIT Media Lab, where he talks a bit about the concerns associated with the AI and generalized AI being largely driven by people who have a single value system. In other words, minimal diversity in what they value, why they value it, what they view to be socially optimal, their experience sets, etc. And the reason that this is a challenge is because there actually is no universal value system that's valid, in the sense that it's validatable. So one of the reasons why we have to be really careful about how we think about building DAOs is because we are often making what I call subjective choice, like basically subjective choices of objective measures. So if we describe our system as optimizing or facilitating something, then when we do math and we do engineering and we try to make it achieve a goal, we have defined that goal, and that goal is imposed upon the participants in some way. Now, there's some important aspects to this that get to governance, and they get to actually more broadly, the mathematical applied governance is generally cybernetics. I'm not going to try to go into a detailed lecture of cybernetics. I don't think this is the right time for that. But I do want to continue to sort of motivate the use of what I would call AI and automation ethics as the driving version or part of the engineering design ethics that are relevant for people who are working on DAOs. So for the moment, I'm going to kind of pause to make sure that I answer any questions about this idea that we have a community scale system that people are opting to participate in, but in doing so, they are also being influenced, and there's really no way around it. There's no clear line between participation in a DAO and being influenced by a DAO, because its job is to facilitate a coordination that has no absolute answer. There is no one right answer, so we can't engineer it as though it's discovering some one right answer.
Can you define ethics? I know it's off topic. I don't know if someone has a question that's more on topic, but just like a baseline.
Do this as what I'm actually going to do is I will appeal to authority just so that we're working. I'm going to ethics definition, And I like to usually bucket it out and talk specifically about either engineering ethics or business ethics and other things. But if we want to go all the way to the base, let's just pull up the Google version.
I can read Google because I just did it too. Moral principles that govern a person's behavior or conducting an activity.
Interesting. That makes sense. It's kind of fuzzy in my opinion, but you know, it's a good concept. I tend to characterize it in terms of the definition of engineering ethics. So if we Google that, this has more to do with the responsibility of a creator to those who will be using or experiencing their creations. So engineering ethics, and I will do the same thing. We'll read it. Engineering ethics. Engineering ethics is the field of system of moral principles that is applied to the practice of engineering. The field examines the obligations by engineers to society, their clients, and to the profession. And as a scholarly discipline, it is closely related to the philosophy of science, philosophy of engineering, and ethics of technology. Now, the reason that I bring up engineering ethics is because as someone who is engineering educated, there are literally required courses and licenses associated with learning what these obligations are. And they're generally similar to things you might think of in terms of other socially focused professions, medicine, etc. Like you literally you can't knowingly do harm, and you in fact have an obligation to be aware of the harm that you might do and to avoid doing it. And these are concepts that are pretty deeply ingrained in civil engineers and mechanical engineers or anyone who's building infrastructure, something that is meant in its base purpose to be consumed potentially somewhat passively by the public at large. And I am arguing that what we are doing now with DAOs is actually economic infrastructure, and therefore it should be governed by the type of engineering ethics that's applied to the theory of making physical infrastructure, that you need to not only attempt to not do harm, but you actually have to attempt to be informed enough to know what harm you might do and mitigate the risk of that harm. And this is a level beyond what is normally done in a software engineering and gave rise to the sort of Web 2.0 industry, where everyone essentially said, hey, we'll wing it and see what happens. And one would argue that pretty significant harm was done to our social systems through the evolution of the sort of Web 2.0 stack. Not to say that we could have known, maybe we wouldn't have ever been able to figure it out, but arguably we skipped the part where we stopped and said, we're changing the infrastructure of our social and economic systems. What might go wrong? Does that help, Griff?
A lot, yeah.
Okay, cool. So, and you guys are still on my slides, so let me jump back. So I had jumped to this because in the case of economics and social and economic systems, when these are inherently algorithmic and we're making things that use algorithms to mediate or facilitate these sorts of transformations from like basically small, private, decentralized, individual information. That information includes both things you know, things you believe, things that motivate you, your incentives personally, your private utilities. This is all information that's spread out in the world. It's messy, time varying, it's in people. And when we talk about coordinated decision making, we're trying to mix that human process with machine processes to create discrete outcomes like decisions, concrete events. And that say, we will do this. Or, you know, again, we have our conviction voting analysis where we talk about passing proposals. We have other governance processes. We have, you know, potentially price processes derived from bonding curves. All of these are this class of hybrid algorithm human interaction. And so we have to think of this like a system that is neither computational nor human, but its properties come from the way those two things interact with each other. And that interaction is non-trivial, and we don't totally understand it. So we're doing something, again, inherently biomimetic in our best efforts, because we're saying like, well, we don't really know, so let's imitate things that we've seen in the world information processing wise that actually do turn noisy information into discrete outcomes, hence things like action potentials and neurons firing. We still don't know that those are best, but the reason why we take that tack in our approach is because we at least have some analogies in biology to work off of. My main point, I guess, in this first branch is just to say that, like, what are we doing? Why does engineering ethics apply? And how is it also different from traditional engineering? You could argue it's, again, closer to something like a bioengineering where we're messing with things that we don't totally understand the ramifications of. I kind of want to continue to sort of pause and make sure that we can have discussions, because this is also not meant to be a sort of one-sided thing. Like, ethics is also a topic that Kevin Werebach told me. I met with, he's an ethics professor from Penn. Data and blockchain stuff is his main focus now, but I actually sat with him and asked him, how to think about ethics in this space, and he said to me pretty precisely that no one can actually tell you what ethics is. By definition, the people who are out in the world trying to change the world have to have an embedded sort of like compass, because the world is complex enough that, like, there's never going to be a set of heuristics where I can say, yep, you were ethical. But at the same time, it's not something where you can just, it's not whatever you want. It's about having a sort of internal, like, alignment with the idea of the social good. To whatever extent you can estimate it, to whatever extent you can define it, is something that matters to you, and you don't deprioritize it just because it's not always clear.
I like it.
Cool.
Okay, so I kind of have one more topic on sort of DAOs that I want to hit, and this is this idea. Well, actually, as a couple, but I want to talk about this because I was talking with Bernd earlier. I'm going to use the word control because it's the formal name for the mathematical theory that involves how one system steers another system. This is the term that is very often problematic in narrative space because its implications aren't necessarily aligned with its reality from a technical or academic perspective. And I wanted to use democracy as an example of a closed loop control system that is actually dynamic and adaptive, but that is actually still a sequence of control. So we can think about a governance process as the decision-making body that is determining the set of legal, acceptable, or valid actions for another body. So in a sense, you're saying one group, process, like entity, however it's defined, is doing the high level, this is okay, this is not okay. It's law setting, norm setting, smart contract coding, parameter setting. This is the, I don't think there's a lot of confusion in what I mean here, but it's the top, it's the messy human, we make the decisions, and then those decisions are codified in some way. And then what is codified is then further imposed upon another population. But you need to have that population have a control path that is transparent and efficient back over the governance process. So if any one of those lines break, you lose the sort of multi-scale adaptivity that is the inherent property of a process that we can call democracy. And I'm being loose with democracy depending on who you ask. It could be very tightly defined set of processes like one person, one vote, or you could just say that, in this case, I simply mean that this loop is totally closed and that the processes are in some way determined to be fair. But the definition of fair is itself not well defined in a lot of cases. So we're simply saying governance imposes rule sets. Rule sets are imposed on the population. The population gets to modify the means by which those rule sets are modified. So there's a full loop of modifying the modifier's modifier, thus creating a closed loop adaptive system. And there are, an infinity of ways to do this, but there's also an infinity of ways to fuck this up. So I want to point out that when we talk about systems that are intended to be decentralized, and we also mean that we want people to have agency in them. And an important way to understand agency is that this loop is complete. And if there are inefficiencies in this loop, that's fundamentally undermining the agency of the population.
Cool. Are you, is there a particular reason you use the word population versus like community or anything like that? It wasn't.
Not specifically. In fact, if we want to get into the notion of communities, let's actually do that now. Because I had started to sketch out this next slide that I hadn't filled in yet, is that at the community level, the system is going to have a well-defined set of rules and norms at any time. But at the individual level, we want to be able to empower multi-membership and inter-community mobility. This is the concept of voting with your feet, which is actually distinct from voting in the temporal process that I just showed you. So there, we're imagining the way that you change your situation through time. And in this case, we're talking about how you would change your situation through space. You would enter or leave a different community that has a different rule set that you prefer. And it's important that you have the ability to opt in and out in addition to like change the one that you're in. And so from a perspective, we could have used the word community here. I used population because I was just making the slides. I think it's reasonable either way. But definitely when we start to get into inter-community mobility and multi-membership, it's important to think of the population as the full set of people, and that people then have essentially mappings to communities. And as much as possible, we want the idea that the choices of communities that people participate in are under their control. Although they may not always be able to fully steer them, they can partake in choosing to steer them, or they can choose to exit and participate in another, or even pick a portfolio of communities. And in fact, I don't know if I imported it over, but I have some slides that are like from an identity talk where I talk about the way in which my personal identity is context dependent, and I have family, and I have friends, and I have collaborators, and I have all of these spaces, and I have chosen those subsets, and I might even have different expectations and relationships with those subsets, and that when we think about multi-membership, that's really already a thing. So we're not changing the ontology of communities, we're simply acknowledging it and taking it into account in the way that we try to flesh out these systems.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes I like to talk about like what is a community and what is a organization. And I start with this idea that for any two parties, there's a notion of coordination that says, I have some restrictions, some requirements, some desires, needs, etc. So do you. And in fact, the feasible interactions between us that are, again, healthy in the sense that neither is forcing something on the other lives in this overlap set. And we don't need these to be perfectly overlapping to have communities or organizations, because an organization is actually just a web of connections. And we can have a highly heterogeneous community with diverse requirements, diverse value propositions, expectations, knowledge, etc., as long as we have some base level of shared norms and expectations, and that all of the individual coordinations are not forced, that they're by choice. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so that's kind of where I come to on DAO stuff. I would say I love this slide. I talk about it a lot because I think it's all too often that as humans, we want to find the optimal objective instead of understanding that, any choice of objective is just a thing that we're choosing. When it comes to governance, this means recognizing that we need to be able to change the objectives themselves. When it comes to dealing with social good, it means recognizing that it's the algorithms themselves, not the outcomes, that represent the fairness. I tend to tie back to two key topics for this. One is the idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. This is a really kind of hackneyed quote, but it's really critical, because if you don't accept that your models are imperfect, then you will imbue them with too much respect. Like, you need to understand both their power and their limitations in order to avoid taking them to slippery slopes where you justify things that shouldn't be justifiable using them. And then in the case of Rawls and his definition of a just society, when I say that fairness is the property of the algorithm, not the outcome, it's very possible and likely that there are going to be undesirable outcomes. No one can always be, we can never have everyone be happy always at the same time. As long as there's diversity, there's going to be some heterogeneity. And what we really care about is whether or not these systems have this adaptability, this agency, this sort of opting in and opting out, moving through the system, participating in system change, because those are the things that basically make it so that randomly getting dropped into this society or randomly dropped into this community or into this system isn't, you know, I don't want to say evil, but like I'm imagining like a caste, system where if you're a tier 1 member, then you're like set for life, and if you're a tier 5 member, you're fucked for life, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's extremely unfair. If you are in a system which has, well-defined adaptability and mobility, you might still randomly get dropped into a society where your position is not one that suits you, but that isn't a trap where you're stuck there. You would ideally opt into an environment or a community where the things that you care about, they care about, or you are be able to help adapt the way the system you're in works to align with you better. And again, this is not a perfect solution because we're not arguing that there is a perfect outcome. We're focusing on the social systems as adaptive systems and their tuning between their ability to be changed and their ability to be constant enough for us to live in. Because one of the things that also gets appreciated is the fact that if the world that you live in, the rule sets, I guess the concepts that I addressed here, can change too fast, if the possible interaction patterns, set of legal or acceptable valid actions, etc., change too fast, then the world is actually not a very safe feeling place. There's not a lot of incentives to participate in the rules if the rules change too much. So there's actually a kind of trade-off, which is not always totally appreciated, between the rates of change. The systems need to be able to change, and you need to be able to move. But it's not necessarily the case that you want the system to have such high frequency changes in it that it doesn't feel safe or static or allow planning in life. And so, we deal with this a little bit when we talk about conviction voting and tuning timescales, and that's just this one example. Broadly speaking, when we're talking about DAOs and what it means to design for people's well-being, we have to balance between the concepts of how changeable things are from people don't get stuck in places that are bad for them or don't work for them, and the fact that things need to be able to they need to be able to change, and they need to be static enough that people can have security and safety in a sense that the world isn't just like rocking around them. Does that make sense?
Yep, definitely. I'm excited we're getting into this veil of ignorance stuff.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to sort of not go too far into some of this other stuff that I was working on, but I will talk a little bit about, I think, business type ethics, because I think it's important given what we're dealing with, blockchain space, fundraising, etc. And for this, I think the most important thing is to understand that narratives are also models. So when you tell a story, you're telling a story to influence someone, and you're influencing them to do something. And there's a responsibility that comes with that the delta between the story you're telling and the reality that you're creating isn't too large. And a reason I say that there's a delta at all is because narrative is a low-dimensional model. It's a space which is very much tied to how you make someone feel. and that you're making them feel something in order to influence them to do something. And ultimately, that doing needs to also be in their interest. But the story that gets them to do it and the facts of how it's good for them are not always like perfectly aligned, because the reality part can often be very deep, especially when it involves AI, technology, a lot of this other stuff we're talking about. And so you have to basically be intellectually honest in the sense that you are not motivating someone to do something that is like not in their best interest, or at least, not, I guess you can't know that it's in their best interests, but it's sort of like understanding that if you live in a world of models where narrative is a model, your design is a model, your execution is a future thing, that like you have to acknowledge that there are deltas between these things and mitigate those deltas so that they're all sort of pointing the same direction, even if, and again, I'm a math nerd, they're in different dimensional spaces. Like you've got the real execution in like n-dimensional space, and you've got your design work in some like 5-dimensional space that's trying to achieve some goals, and you've got your narrative in this like 1 or 2-dimensional and very emotionally like motivational space. That those vectors, even though they're in different dimensions, we need them to kind of point in the same direction. I know this is a very nerd mathematician's way of talking about business ethics, but my experience has been that I have been most unhappy with the behavior of people if I could perceive it in this model and I felt as though the arrows pointed in different directions. Like you were saying one thing, motivating one thing, and doing something else. But it's difficult because they're not directly comparable when they're in different dimensionalities or different complexities. We talk a lot about simplifying things to make them accessible to people, but there's some compression, there's some loss. Whenever you take a high complexity thing and express it more simply, you are sacrificing the clarity of some aspects for the clarity of other aspects. And those sacrifices, again, if you think of it as a compression, this idea for me, business ethics, is about the fidelity of that compression. You don't want to decompress it and have it look like something else and like not be recognizable. And a lot of our more practical discussions around legal requirements and both the spirit and the nature of the laws and regulations associated with this effort, they're all there for the same reason, to help make it happen. But there's a difference between the rules and the spirit of the rules. And I think that we have to do both. The idea of being ethical in business is not arbitraging the rules, but to understand the rules are there. They're there to guide you in the direction of doing something. And in fact, they also are a representation of a set of values, and that whenever possible, we want to be making sure that we are asking ourselves both whether we're following the spirit of those rules and, to the extent that we can understand them, the letters of those rules. And again, this isn't really traditional business ethics territory. This is a little bit still more the way that a cyberneticist thinks about ethics. But I'm a math nerd, and you guys have to deal with it. Do you want to stop for questions and kind of talk about this?
So are you, I'm just curious about your last point, saying that basically since we're building these complex systems on multiple layers, that we can kind of synthesize those ethics into something cohesive, as opposed to them existing on separate levels and not really
I'm saying that kind of. I'm not saying that there is a concrete or mathematical way to synthesize them. What I'm saying is that I'm using an abstraction of dimensionality to say that the complex system is extremely high dimensionality. The designs are reduced dimensionality. They're less complex than real crazy messy human systems, but they're an intentional modeling and focus, and we're making decisions to try to accomplish specific goals. And then the narratives are even simpler still, but that those things, we can think of them as directional, and we need all three of those to be directionally the same, even if they live in different spaces. And that what it would mean to be ethical in this kind of complex systems design is to at least be aware of the effort to keep those pointing the same direction, even if they can't naturally live in the same space.
Pointing in the same direction?
The narratives, the models, and the execution.
Okay.
So narratives are like I guess, maybe what I'm trying to say is that I'm describing each one of these things as sort of, think of it like thrusts or movements or efforts of our community, right? We're doing stuff together. We're trying to move the world in a certain direction. We're doing it through narrative, we're doing it through design, and we're doing it through execution, right? All of those are movements. They have a sort of directionality to them, even though they live in kind of different dimensions. So narrative is low dimensional. It's like, and I don't mean to say that as a negative thing. It's just we have to simplify and tell stories that are meant to get people to feel this direction we want them to move in, which is fundamentally different from a design, which is also fundamentally different from an execution. But those tides have to be flowing in the same direction. And the ethical concern is that sometimes narratives are the ones that deviate the furthest from the design and execution, precisely because they get to the point where your goals are so motivational and aspirational that you can lose track of the tether to the other two. And I don't see that as a risk. I mean, we've done a really good job, I think, as a team, really focusing on this. But I have seen challenges where, and I'm sure you've all met people, where the sales and fundraising side is seems almost completely disconnected from reality. And so for my take, business ethics, particularly in the context of engineering ethics, is about being cognizant of those gaps and not letting them deviate too much. Understanding that they can never be perfectly one-to-one because they don't live in the same level of complexity.
Can you give a solid example of an ethical issue that we might run into by chance, like especially in our narrative? I mean, I can think of some, but maybe.
So I mean, an ethical issue would be if we were to try to tell people that they would definitely, no matter what, profit, because that's never going to be certainly the case, right? There's always a risk-reward trade-off, and this is the main spirit of securities law, is to say, look, you can't promise someone something to get them to do something, motivate them, or kind of trick them into thinking that there's no risk-reward trade-off. Now, honestly, again, we've talked about this a lot, like we have to balance the narrative of the enthusiasm about the potential of a reward through a sequence of processes with the reality of the barriers that stand between that potential outcome, the reality of the risks associated with that never happening, so that people aren't just like, oh, I'm going to make you money, and then they give you money, and then they don't make money, and you've exploited them. Now, I use this example only because it's literally the whole central theme of why we have securities law in the first place. And it's there, like, as much as we might argue that securities are over-regulated in the sense that there's, at least in the US, where the rules are so heavy that they're actually blocking people from opportunities that they should have the right to. The spirit of the law is to make sure that someone can't be so aspirational and motivational in the absence of the real design and the real execution that they take, they scam you. And so I would say that that's by far the most important business ethical consideration for anyone raising funds. But I do think that, even our last breakout session with Barron and Jeff and Adam, we were like really stopping and asking questions about what's the law? What's the spirit of the law? What can we say? What should we say? We want people to engage for the real reason, even as much as we have to sometimes simplify it down to make that accessible to them.
Cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that for now, I've been sending some stuff back and forth with Jeff. We were talking about this both from a narrative perspective and a talk. I would say the final topic really that ties us back to Common Stack is this title that I have not yet fleshed out. But I'm saying this thing called the diversity of DAOs, or towards the diversity of DAOs. And what I mean here is that a single DAO design is fundamentally insufficient because it fails to meet the criteria for multi-membership and inter-community mobility. So we're not just making a DAO and saying every DAO should be like this. In fact, we're saying, here are some practices for helping someone realize a DAO that is going to be aligned with the value systems of the people who choose to instantiate it, and that those people can continue to adapt it and they can continue to enter and leave. And broadly speaking, this means that we need a world where there are non-profit style DAOs, there are for-profit style DAOs, there are ... who knows what people are going to come up with. We've got hedge fund style DAOs. We've got these institutional infrastructures that shouldn't be plug and play. They're not modular homes in the sense that everyone should have the same one. In order to have a healthy sort of decentralized community of communities, we are choosing to focus on making it possible for a community to self-actualize at the community level. And I know that sounds really complicated, but the point is that if you don't have the idea that the DAOs themselves are diverse, you can't actually have real agency in the participants, because then they're essentially stuck with one set of rules, one set of value systems. And while I don't have the links now, there's another article that I can send out about multi-scale systems and actually the value and power of having more than one value system in the world. Because there is no unique optimal value system, in as much as they might not always be consistent with each other, we actually have a healthier political economy when people have the ability to sort of make some choices about the value systems that they participate in. And that's still not saying that you need to be perfectly tolerant of every behavior, because some things are also just in like, no one should be like ever supporting genocide. But at the same time, what we're saying is that we can't draw sharp lines in the sand very easily. So we're talking about, allowing these sort of adaptive social systems to emerge and evolve, rather than saying that we want a top down, this is okay, that's not okay. It's like, that's the rule, take it or leave it. You don't have any control, you can't change who's in it. So
what I'm hearing is that instead of having a code of ethics for the common stack, it's really up to every individual to make sure that they are following their own code of ethics.
That is true, but what I am describing is something a bit like a meta ethics, where I'm saying that not all ethics are equal. It's not like I'm not trying to say that all value systems are equal, because you can construct value systems that are, quite evil. In fact, we can find them in history, right? So like, entire societies that are run on narratives and principles that we could, never support: slavery, Holocaust, etc. So there's a tricky thing going on here where I'm saying we can't say that there is one set of ethical rules that everyone has to follow without sacrificing what I would call value system diversity, which is valuable. But at the same time, diversity doesn't mean that every possible configuration of ethics is good. So we're essentially, think of it like a constellation or an ecology of belief systems and value systems that we hope is, we'll say, like healthy, in that it allows good discourse, it allows us to challenge each other's assumptions and try to collectively emerge to something that is good for the largest number of people without strong a priori assumptions about what's good for them.
How do we, as the common stack, maintain good ethical conduct?
I think I will say we need to be willing to check each other, in the sense that by not defining one list of ethical rules that we all follow, we are essentially shifting to what I would call peer-to-peer validation, where we are open to and continually willing to ask and answer each other's questions about whether a particular thing is would be considered, what you would consider it an ethical behavior. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, it's almost like a gossip protocol that allows us to not predefine the rules, but it should prevent us from diverging to inappropriate behavior, because you would expect anything that's truly problematic in a diverse community to be flaggable by someone.
Is there anything that the Common Stack can do to disincentivize or disencourage people to set up systems using our infrastructure with damaging value systems?
That's a good question. And I think that in the short term, the answer might be no. And I say that not because I don't want it to be no, but I think that unfortunately there's a direct tension between inclusivity and judgment, and that in the short term, in the phase that we're at, obviously we're controlling the use of our work directly through our membership, and we're making an effort to curate people who have both diversity of value systems and diversity of preferences and expertise, and some alignment in dimensions that are effectively ethical, in the sense that they have expressed a genuine will to make the world better through some means, etc. And so we are sort of meta-managing it in the way that we are doing our own governance. But because we are open source and we're trying to be inclusive, we will always be facing the risk that someone who doesn't share that forks, clones, or otherwise leverages our work. And I think that it needs to be an area of open consideration, because if we find that that is happening, we might have to take stronger steps to restrict access. But I think we're going to start, or at least I advocate for starting, in the direction of inclusivity, and only decrease inclusivity in response to attacks, essentially.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When I was thinking about it, I was thinking it's almost more at the community level. Like if there's a community that plants trees and a community that supports Holocaust, you could basically could you put a direct economic sanction by saying basically, like, we are not going to interact with your economy. We do not believe in your value system. It's like a national economic sanction.
Yeah. So this comes back to the network of communities. So you could essentially say, first off, that nothing that we make is going to support any direct work by them, but that doesn't mean they can't clone it and mimic it. So what I'm basically saying is, at the graph level, we can cut them out of our network of communities, but we can't actually stop them from forming their own.
Right. Yeah. But we can basically cause them to exist in their own vacuum. And I mean, it's like the internet. How do you prevent perverts from around the world congregating on the internet? You can't. How do you prevent them from launching an economy using the Common Stack? You can't. But you can restrict them from interacting with the full ecosystem of this diversity of DAOs.
And absolutely like economic sanctions, in the sense that if you think of the actual sort of world economics as being a big graph of flows of value, what you're saying is that we refuse to trade with, we refuse to service, we refuse to, and what you're saying is, well, I can't technically remove you from existence, I can make you disconnected from my graph, meaning that you derive no direct benefits from my labor. What the problem is that in an open source world, where we are making things publicly available and accessible, there's always the clone completely disconnected instance that we cannot explicitly stop. And then, extra steps to make it harder are things that you would only introduce if and when, again, in response to attack. Like if there was suddenly a huge, something happened where someone used our work to do something that we were so thoroughly appalled by, then we might have to try to go through some other channels to condemn or block that. But it's not the kind of thing that I think is preemptive in this case. I think it's the kind of thing that we should be aware of, and I hopefully not have to deal with. But if it does become an issue, I mean, I don't really know what the legal options are, but in some cases, I think that you might be able to instigate action against them, even though their action against them is not for stealing our stuff, but for what they're doing at all. So
I'm more concerned about like what we have coming up soon with the fundraise in the ethical dilemmas around the whitelist as well. You know, who we include, who we exclude, on what grounds, and
Yeah.
how, you know. And I think that there's probably a few other ethical questions, and instead of just going into those two, I would be curious to at least put like maybe 3 or 4 minutes into brainstorming ethical issues that we're going to come across in the next couple months.
I think that's a good jumpstart. And I will make one last comment and shut up. That actually, that process that you're proposing might be a good way to prioritize the same kind of meta ethics that I brought up, which was to say that we hold ourselves responsible for being actively discussing what could be an ethical consideration and coming to at least some discussions about it, so that fits in the scope of what I'm proposing, and we might even want to make it something that we schedule on a per month basis, where we do a brainstorm and Q&A, just as a way of saying we're committed to the idea that while we may not have hard answers, we're not going to shirk the responsibility to discuss it.
Where could we do this?
Let's just do it in the Common Stack Core org.
Or we can do it in the agenda notes. There's some notes in there. I'm taking notes in there.
Agenda notes.
I will drop it into I'll put a section at the bottom.
Oh, cool.
On DAO ethics or common stack ethics.
Just at the very bottom.
Yeah.
So we're brainstorming ethical dilemmas we may come up against in the next 3 months in the agenda doc. I don't know. I feel like you might enjoy that exercise.
Currently, do you like to pose the question now?
Yeah, we're just brainstorming silently on the doc. Like, who do we allow on the whitelist? Who don't we allow? Being forthcoming with the financial returns that are possible or financial losses that are possible.
Yeah. That's on site.
And it's in the newest Telegram.
around at 4 o'clock. 60 more seconds for questions.
Yep.
How do we go about answering these?
Does anyone want to be like our ethics lead? Or, you know, like I like Zargham's suggestion about having an ethics meeting once a month to discuss, like creating a space to discuss ethical dilemmas.
I
And
wouldn't. I have unfortunately not paid enough attention, but enough to know. I mean, it's something I care deeply about, and so I wouldn't mind it. Like if it's just like getting the people together and starting a discussion or something.
Sounds fun.
yeah, it does sound fun. And it also sounds important, and like, and it could be also. It'd be nice if it was open, right?
It really ties in with the token engineering theme. Huge. That's basically the main topic of my article on token engineering, which I'm now going to kind of reframe as the open sourcing of CAD through the common stack, but also compounding on the importance of professional and social responsibility of engineers. And given that we are really pushing the token engineering angle, I think this is a really important topic for us to bring along with that.
So it sounds like, Chris, you'd be willing to take on the lead of making sure we have a meeting once a month, and maybe that we address some of these questions.
Yeah, and that we follow up on open action points from the briefing, all this stuff.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can have another ethics meeting before a month. Just gonna throw that out there. Before 1 month from now. Like we have all these ethical issues that we're gonna run into in the next 3 months. I think we might. Yeah, 2 weeks. Some timeline. I'll let Chris decide, but I'm proposing this.
Add it in the notes.
Thanks, Z, for leading this fruitful discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're muted.
I will say that I just unmuted, and actually, if you want, I wouldn't be opposed to having Bernd actually repeat. We had a side conversation just towards there that was actually pretty pointed, and rather than having me continue to mouth off, I actually think it might be cool if Bernd summarized it. Would you be good with that?
Yeah.
I'm going to mute so that he can talk into his computer.
I hope this works. No.
Oh, you have to turn off your sound too, Z. The volume, yeah.
Yeah. So now he's the sound's off. So the question I had is, would we sort of be how clear if we define our ethics, how much do we stick to it in a real hard case scenario? So and I took the DAO or the ETC fork from Ethereum as an example, you know, because you say that it's immutable and whatever is your part, and then something happens that really it almost is like a life-death scenario, and you have to make the decision: do I stick to the ethics and die, or do I change my beliefs or not my values maybe and change that? So, and then we came to a point where we said a fork, like I don't know if you can see that. That's it's actually a good drawing that Z made there. It's so we have these three parts of the ethics. There's like the code part, where you have hard-coded rules in there. Then you have the core group, let's say, that would be us, for example. And then you have the more the community aspect of it, a bit more outside. It could be the members even of the association. And then so if you have a topic where we really divert and we say no, we have the same ethics, but still we interpret them maybe differently or anything like that, then we would say the core the core can still stay the same. The code part could still stay the same, but it gets.
Or we tweaked again. It's a fork, so
it would be a fork. So we would separate that, but then the group around it would maybe overlap. Still, you would have an overlap, And so over time, this overlap would then divert much more. So it would over time you would have like different discussions in each group, and then they separate more and more. And at some point, this is like a cell that's getting into two cells. And at some point, it might happen that one of these groups grows immensely big, and the other one just is very, very small and might even die. Or they still stay the same, and both actually get more attraction, get more people to it. So this is a scenario of how would you go with ethics in the long term, or in the decision making at the end. And the question I asked was, if we define who should become a member, and it's like token engineers, it's people in crypto and so on, and Justin's son applies to invest, become a member, would we accept it even if he fits exactly into this frame? Would we accept that, or would we say no? That's, from a personal belief, I don't want him in there. So that's to me sort of the point where we might get to it, and what we have to just keep in mind. And
I can give my answer. And so what I told him is that this is
warning. 60 seconds time bound.
more like and the
hey, Z. I'm talking over you just to give you a 60-second time bound, because there's a comms meeting they want to do.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. So in this case, though, sorry, I broke my train of thought. The meta ethics concept allows you to say that just because we all agreed before doesn't mean we interpret them all, and you can take a level of trust in the coordinated decision without violating your meta ethics. In other words, I would prefer to say no, but I could choose to accept our collective answer on the grounds that I trust our system above my knowing that my answer is only one signal in that system, and thus it can't always get what it wants. And that I'm actually seeing that even though the outcome isn't what I would have picked, that the system is working as intended, and thus doesn't necessitate this forking scenario, despite the fact that ostensibly I'm being disagreed with. And that's one of the main reasons I propose it this way, because without this, you can't have a diversity of opinions, and the lack of diversity of opinions is more fragile than a situation where we all don't always agree.
I would agree. I like the ETC is an ethical fork. I like it. But okay, I think we got to end the ethics discussion, although I think it was very fruitful. So thank you guys. I'm going to end the live stream.